Next up, we've got Renee Harvey. Renee is a clinical psychologist who has recently relocated to Australia after a long career in the UK as a consultant in the NHS and more recently as an Honorary Research Fellow at Imperial College London in the study of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. She was responsible for leading in service development for people with complex emotional needs in the UK and specialised in training clinicians for this work. Renee was a key member of developing psychedelic interest groups and in establishing and running a psychedelic integration circle in Brighton prior to leaving the UK. She is currently based in Melbourne, working in private practice and part of the developing Australian community in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy research and clinical service. Her talk, titled Psilocybin-Assisted Therapy, will focus on psilocybin, its therapeutic uses and outcomes in various settings for people with a variety of mental health-related challenges. How essential is psychotherapy for the process of change, and what sets it aside from other approaches? The presentation will also cover the key elements in training therapists for this work and why they are important. Thanks, Renee.
Hi. It's lovely to be here, and thanks so much for inviting me to talk about one of my favourite subjects, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. As it was mentioned in the introduction, my interest really skyrocketed after I had the opportunity to work particularly at Imperial with people in the Psychedelic-2 study, which was for treatment-resistant depression. So I'll try to share some of those examples with you. So what we're going to cover today is, first of all, that it's about providing a form of psychological therapy combined with a psychedelic medicine, doing this with a particular aim, helping people with some sort of psychological distress or diagnosis, and in a particular way. So this is not going to cover recreational use. It's going to look particularly at people with mental health challenges and how we can help them. So the usual format, this is how it's developed in various research studies, is that the sessions are organized so that you start off with screening and assessment. Then the dosing is on either side, it's kind of encompassed by a preparation session, dosing session, and then an integration session. And then, as I've indicated there, you've got the it's batched together, another set of those sessions, and then the follow-up sessions. So within the various research studies, those can extend to maybe 3 of those configurations of preparation, dosing, and integration. Or within that configuration, you can have more than one preparation session, and you can have more than one integration session. In some of the studies, the dosing obviously will include a placebo. So some people will start off with a placebo in the first batch and then have a dosing session second batch, or it can even happen the other way around. In the study in London, people were allocated either to a placebo group or to a dosing group. And so we had people going through that only had placebo, and there was quite a bit of a clinical challenge in dealing with the disappointment because it's very hard to disguise the fact that people aren't getting the real thing. Now, I think this format is what's shaping our thinking in how we do therapy with people. But once we start translating this into clinical use, it's worth considering that we might want to expand this quite a lot in terms of the preparation. I certainly think that the more complex the person's history is, the greater the difficulty, the more preparation sessions you need, possibly more integration, and then certainly after this, not just a simple follow-up, but perhaps ongoing therapy. I think that's really going to be important. We've seen from the outcomes that often people have a spectacular improvement and then there's a deterioration afterwards. So I think that we need to build in a proper follow-up in terms of therapy to try and sustain the results for people. So what is the aim? It's helping people in distress, including, and Martin went through some of these. The results, the research studies now are covering a vast range of difficulties. Some of the ones that are mentioned here in this paper, Low et al., are just speculative. and in particular, the more difficult ones like 20, the ones at the bottom, the more personality disorder-based ones, I think are in very early stages, and I think that's where we probably need a lot more work in preparing people and in looking after them after the sessions are over. I've heard anecdotally that when people don't have very good outcomes, it's usually because they have some sort of a personality disorder issue going on. So I think we need to try and think about how we modify what we do when the issues are very complex. So the questions arisen, and it's been talked about a lot now, is do we really need the psychotherapy? A lot of the research now, some of the research is focused on looking for the molecule that makes the difference, looking for the particular brain area where we're going to find this change. And I think this goes back to a more sort of medical model way of looking at the problem, and that is just wanting to find something to replace an antidepressant pill, which you can prescribe, send the person home with, and hoping that it's all very simple. There's even been attempts now to eliminate the psychedelic experience. People saying, well, why do we have to have people go through seeing all the different pretty pictures that they see, or various other subjective experiences they have during the dosing sessions? Should we just try and eliminate that? I was really amused to hear Bill Richards say recently that that's a little bit like taking a person through an art gallery blindfolded. And the other discussions, eliminate the therapy or at least shorten the therapy time. We'll wait to see what happens with studies now that are looking at how you can possibly administer something like DMT and shorten therapy time, see whether they have the same sort of outcomes. So on the other hand, we have the view that the therapy is vital. In fact, even the therapy is the key intervention, and that the substance, the medicine, is really just supplementing the therapy. That was what was in the memorandum submitted to the TGA in 2020, where it stated that the psychological support is essential and that the psychedelic is therefore not the treatment, but the tools to support the psychotherapy. And really, when you think about it, this shouldn't take a lot of convincing people, because we know now that evidence-based treatment for depression generally is regarded as medication plus psychotherapy. So, it may just be that the same thing happens here, where it's the therapy plus the medication that makes the biggest difference. Also, in terms of the effect of the substance creating this disruption of the default mode network and resulting to greater brain plasticity and openness to learning, we really need to capitalize on this opportunity. For me, one of the frustrations in working with people with complex PTSD and complex personality disorder issues has always been that you can do therapy for years on end, and you seem to reach a point where you hit a wall. You can't break through that the barrier. People are so stuck. And this is one of the questions I had was, well, how do we break through this? And I think here we have the answer. I think that psychedelic medicines give us the opportunity to break through those barriers and make very, very deep change that you can't actually get with therapy, certainly not in the shorter term. So what are the common elements in this therapy? You've got set and setting, and I'm going to briefly go through them. Set being the actual setting and the mindset. So in the preparation sessions is where we have to manage set. There may be some issues that are picked up during assessment that straight away show you that you've got something to deal with first of all. One of the more common ones is people come in saying, I've read Michael Pollan's book and I just want a transformation, and it's probably going to be my last resort. It makes my blood run cold when people come in and say, this is my last chance. I've tried everything else, and if this doesn't work, I don't know what I'm going to do, i.e., possibly in more extreme cases, people can get really, really desperate. So there's something about working with managing people's expectations of therapy and making them understand that a lot of work needs to be done before and after if people are really going to make changes, find something meaningful, and actually have this change into a meaningful difference in their lives. One of the potential disappointments is people are expecting these very, very deep spiritual transformations, and sometimes the experience can be relatively mundane, or it can seem to be. But it's worth considering that, and this is something I like to tell people as a matter of course, is what comes to you will be what you need to deal with next. You know, the lesson is exactly what it needs to be. Another question in the setting is whether you, whether you do goal setting or not. There are some approaches where you get the person to write down their goals and do all kinds of planning in terms of what they could plan to experience or try and get themselves to experience. And in my experience, again, this just flies out of the window very often with psilocybin. You can try and set as many goals as you like, but the psilocybin is going to take you where you need to go. Another part of the set is creating predictability as far as possible. So it's very important to take the person through what's likely to happen in the experience, and so that there are very few surprises apart from what's going to happen inside themselves. So there's something about structuring the way the day is going to go, giving them information about, you know, what the onset's going to feel like, how long it's going to take, that sort of thing. Practical issues like what happens if they need a bathroom break. A lot of reassurance that they will, at the most, for the most part of the day, have two therapists in the room with them, that one therapist may leave for a very short break. We sometimes negotiated with people whether they wanted us to tell them if one person is leaving the room. Some people felt that they wanted us to just touch them on the arm and say, whatever the name is, Joe, whatever's leaving the room for 5 minutes, and then tell them when they're coming back in. Then that also raises the issue of touch, working with how you're going to get people's attention. If they need you to hold their hand, how that will happen. It's quite a good point to do some rehearsing on how that'll happen. Touch is a tricky situation. It's a tricky topic with people that have possibly been traumatized. And also, I know that certainly in my own training, I was trained not to touch people. No touch was allowed. And I've heard it said recently that you could say in this kind of therapy, actually it's unethical not to touch people if they need it. So there needs to be very clear setting up of the boundaries and the limitations of how this is going to happen. It needs to be made very clear there will never, ever be any sexual touch. And that I like to ensure people that the touch will only happen when everyone's in the room. One of the biggest reassurances you can give people is to tape the sessions, videotape the sessions, so that they know that there's no possibility of anything untoward happening. The other aspect to think about is this concept that MAPS emphasizes a lot, and that is the inner healing intelligence. This is pretty much a core part of MAPS' therapy, where they are describing to the person that we all have this inner healing intelligence, or you could call it an inner wisdom, something within ourselves that propels us towards healing, that propels us towards finding what is right for us. And the goal of the therapist is to really help foster that and to help bring that out. And what this turns on its head is the notion that the therapist has got anything to do with the healing. And for some people from their training, it's quite hard to let go of this notion, because they come into this therapy thinking that they are the healing element here. They are the ones that are doing the therapy, which sets the participant or the client up as a passive recipient of the other person's skill or talent or whatever it is. And we don't want that at all. What we want is to mobilize that person's sense of they actually are the people that know most about what's going on with them. And we're just there to facilitate and help that along. These call them mantras are what Bill Richards is very strong on repeating in his training and what he's learned from years and years of experience, is to teach people these mantras and then use them in the therapy. First being trust, let go, be open. Encourage people to really just open themselves up to the process, trust that the therapists are there to help them, and that they will be okay, and to just let go. Of course, it's very hard. One of the things I just should have said in managing expectations is very often people are very frightened when they start losing control, and they may even feel like they're dying. They might think that this letting go of control, the sort of ego dissolution, means that they are dying. And it's important to kind of let them understand that that's not the case. And this is just the ego letting go, and that really they should be open to it. The other one is in and through, and that is whatever happens, whatever you encounter in your path, go towards it, go into it, go through. If there's an open door, go through. If there's a staircase, climb up. If there's a monster, approach it, talk to it. In the ayahuasca experiences, they often talk about the anaconda, and again, as Bill Richards says, if you see the mouth of the anaconda in front of you, dive in and look out through its eyes. I don't think I've come across anything quite as dramatic with psilocybin, but it can get pretty scary. It can be quite daunting for people to go ahead and follow that. So in the setting, the first thing about this is the room. The image on the bottom left is the Johns Hopkins standard one, and that shows an ideal situation where you set the room up to look like a comfortable living room as much as possible, soft furnishing, soft lighting. The reality in some of the research situations is more like the two on the right, the top one being where you have a hospital room with all the equipment, and it becomes pretty hard to soften that and to kind of make it feel a little bit more like a lounge. The one just below that is what we got to eventually at Imperial, where we managed to soften it quite a lot. There were screens around the room and curtains and salt lamps, and when the main lights were off, it was a very soft, very gentle atmosphere. And this extends to the ensuite bathroom, where unfortunately sometimes we weren't allowed to do that. So people come out in the middle of a session and then go into this bathroom with the bright neon lights. So not an ideal situation, but that was about the best we could do in that situation. The music is the next element. Music is incredibly important. It's important to get it right. There are lots of playlists available now. And easily accessible. Important to be flexible on this, because people might not like the same kind of music, or there might be a track they don't like. So therapists need to negotiate with the person how they would say, look, I don't like that track, please fast forward to the next one. Generally, people would not be able to select their own tracks because they could just come in with heavy metal or something that's really not going to be conducive to the process. The other option I think is important to give people is no music at all. If they don't want to have music, they should be allowed to not have music. Then the therapists, the next component. So for the therapists, a lot of what has to happen in training is for people to let go of some of the stuff they've learned before and some of the habits they've developed in their years as being therapists, and it can be quite challenging for them too. So there's this delicate balance of being there fully with a person, being with them, and then, it also at the same time stepping aside and let the process happen. Helping the person to wonder, to be open, to wonder about what's going to happen. It's quite important to try and eliminate not being open yourself, your own anxieties, your own fears. You need to try and work on yourself, work in supervision, work with your co-therapist to try and not come across as being afraid yourself. This relates to working on yourself in psychotherapy, doing ego work yourself. Don't come into this work if you've got an ego or something to prove. Important to work on your own shadow, the Jungian concept of the shadow. It's pretty good policy to choose people for this training who have been through some life challenges themselves and been through therapy and done some work on themselves. Beware of transference, counter-transference. These would be, for people who don't know, the dynamics that can happen between therapists and clients, where the client will transfer onto the therapist, perhaps a notion of them being parental, or the counter-transference corollary of that, where as a therapist you start thinking of the client like a child. And, you can't necessarily eliminate this, because therapy is set up so that you have usually a male-female dyad, and there is a kind of parental replication there. But it's important to be aware of this and not carry it too far. It needs to be managed. Beware of explanations in terms of biology. Beware of explanations in terms of your own pet theory. This is really not a time to try and explain it away. You need to be as open as you possibly can. So trust, let go, be open, and in and through applies to the therapist too. They have to apply those things to their own experience. Therapists sitting in the session with the person experiencing psilocybin really should be almost participating in the process themselves. Although you're not taking the substance, it's a good opportunity for you to get into a meditative space and start thinking about yourself and what happens there, particularly if the sessions are very quiet. Sometimes sessions can be quiet for hours on end. Your own experience is very important here. And the other part of managing in the beginning is that clients will often say, well, have you ever had psilocybin yourself, and what was it like for you? I think it's important. It's good to be open, but it's good to bear in mind that question has a purpose. The purpose is usually that the client wants to know whether you understand and whether you're going to judge and reject them, or whether you can cope with it. And I think you address those parts of it rather than launch into a whole disclosure about what happened to you in the past. If you haven't had the experience, then it's okay to say that, but I think it's quite important to try and know what it's about. And this is why I'm very excited by the research that's happening at Monash early next year with Paul Ignatsky, where we're doing psilocybin for generalized anxiety disorder. He's just had permission to give the therapists the experience of psilocybin as part of their training, which is absolutely excellent. Very, very exciting. So in selecting people, you almost need to come into this with a set of qualities that are there before the training. You could train some of this, but some of these have to be in place beforehand. And Phelps's paper talks about empathic abiding presence, where you just your being there is the reassuring, quiet presence that people need. To be able to enhance trust, to inspire trust in people, to have a spiritual intelligence. Janice Phelps' course was developed at the California Institute for Integral Studies, and they're very strong on the notion of including spiritual understanding. This is important because people will have experiences that can be described as spiritual, metaphysical. And although this doesn't require you to actually have any particular belief system of your own, but you need to know how to be open to this and how to work with this with people. As was mentioned before, people can have very deep mystical experiences. And we know from the Johns Hopkins reports that people say that this is the most life-changing and therapeutic part of their journey. So we need to be open to it. So therapists need to have a good knowledge of the physical and psychological effects of psychedelics, self-awareness and ethical integrity that comes with therapy, proficiency in complementary techniques. The therapists need to let go of some of the stuff they come in with, but also need to be open to learning about new things. One of the other things that I was definitely not taught in my training was any of the somatic oriented stuff, how to work with the body processes. So I think it's up to therapists to educate themselves in that as well. You might need to actually use some of those techniques in the session itself. It's a good policy that if you don't have those qualities, is to pair up with somebody who does, so that your co-therapist can complement what you know. So in terms of the actual experience, it's important that people are open to this notion. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek. Joseph Campbell. C.G. Jung wrote a lot about this as well. So the themes that often come up in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy are this notion of running from the monster or being chased by your shadow. So this is also why we encourage people to go for the experience, because often if you try and run away, it'll follow you, like your shadow is always behind you. And sometimes the further you run away, the longer the shadow, the bigger the shadow becomes, the more scary it becomes. So it is important to try and deal with that. Facing the very thing that you would rather avoid, the thing that years of therapy may have uncovered. So one of the key questions up front is to ask people in the preparation session is, what is the one thing you really, really, really don't want us to talk about? Because that's likely to be the thing that comes up. The other thing can be that it's like when you reorganize the cupboards in your house, you often end up with a mess first. Like everything looks terribly disorganized before you pack everything away again. And in this kind of therapy, it's like rebuilding your whole house, if you can imagine what a drastic shift that can be. So the opportunity of the disruption of the default mode network can give you a chance to reconstruct from the ground up. So some of the models that come in here, the things that I think therapists should be aware of, maybe read up on if they're not familiar with it. Perinatal matrices is a concept written about by Stan Grof in relation to his work with LSD. And this describes the stages of the birth, a child going through the birth canal and being born into the world, that can sometimes come up as themes. Sometimes people can have something that seems like a rebirthing process during a session. So it's worth knowing about these theories and keeping them in mind to possibly inform how you understand it. Parts theories seems to be more popular now. This notion that there are parts within yourself and how you allow them all to be, how you allow them all to kind of exist together. That's another kind of notion to bear in mind. The shamanic models, these notions of soul retrieval, good model to know about. Facing the shadow, I've talked about, Jungian aspects. Uncovering trauma. People will come out with trauma in psilocybin sessions quite often. Encountering the anaconda, I mentioned that before. And working with transpersonal. So these are, and the somatic approaches. So when it comes to integration, our next topic, there's also integration for the therapist. There's integration of these therapies. It's about putting together these different models and trying to think in a way that incorporates a lot of these ideas and being flexible to move between them. So I do believe that after many years now of therapies developing, splintering off, developing their own specializations, and each of these seeming to have a 3-letter acronym, there's always a new 3-letter acronym to come up with. I think now we're trying to put this back together again and try and think more in a more integrated way. For the participants, when you start getting to the integration, notions of integration for the clients or participants, I see it as going through stages like this, and they may not always go in the sequence, but roughly they follow the sequence. The first reaction usually is that the person is trying to make sense of what happened. They're trying to create a narrative. And I think the initial session the whole of the first session can be taken up by this person just very excitedly talking about what they saw. and what happened. I personally think it's a mistake to try and intervene there and try and bring in some kind of explanation or interpretation. That person just needs to kind of get it all out. It's like a person telling you about a dream. You want them to tell it, just tell it as it happened. When they get to the end of it, let them start again, because sometimes the second time round, they come out with new details. So that can sometimes take an entire session. In the integration groups that we ran in the UK, this is how we ran them. We used to have a circle that went on for about 2.5 hours, and we'd have a group of up to about 8 people, and people would elect to talk, and they'd get the first 20 minutes uninterrupted to just talk. And then we said to the people in the circle, we said to the people that the speaker is the one who determines what happens next. If they want questions, they can invite questions, or if they want comments. But if they want you to say nothing, then please respect that and say nothing. The second phase then is retaining the treasure. If the person has ventured into the cave where the dragon is and they found the precious treasure that the dragon holds, or in Ros Watts' ACE model, they've dived down into the sea and they found the pearl in the clam at the bottom of the sea. They need to find a way to hold on to that, because it's very easy for that to get lost. It's as easy as forgetting your dream. You could wake up after a wonderful dream and you're excited about it, but by tomorrow you've forgotten what that's about. Unless you've written it down, unless you've spoken to people, unless you worked with a therapist through what it means, unless you symbolized it in some way, you've done a drawing or a painting or written a poem or something, that's how you consolidate it in memory. That's how you create something that you can go back to in future to remind yourself of what happened. So part of the integration session is working out for the person what's comfortable for them. What's their particular way in which they'd like to retain this treasure and remind themselves of what happened? Maybe it is just writing a simple letter to themselves, or retaining an object that symbolizes it, or finding a particular place where they can meditate and they can recall what happened. Or going back to the group that they shared it with. The next phase here is then working with healing wounds and trying to think about how what the experience was about fits in with the past, what that means, and how they're going to take the work forward. Taking the work forward, I believe if these sessions have happened properly, people don't necessarily want to plunge back into another session too quickly. In the structure that I gave you earlier, they sometimes about 6 weeks later, they go into a second session. But, outside of that situation, people can take years to work through what's just happened. And they get a much better chance to reach a stage where they feel that they are ready to go in and have a look again. An awful lot of work can happen in terms of the wounds and the past with what they've brought back after just one trip. The next phase then is making changes, and making those changes on a personal level, the internal, the way you think about yourself, and then the external changes. So with this comes a very strong message to people: don't go out and resign your job or get divorced straight after a session. Excuse me, I'm just going to drink some water. But to hold on to that very carefully and think about it before you go and make changes. I beg your pardon. But I think, it is good if people think about making external changes. This can be things like changing how they relate to other people, changing friendship groups if they have to. And then maybe in time changing a job, getting away from a toxic situation. And sometimes when people go back, they revert back to a state of depression, and it's easy to say, oh, the therapy didn't work. Well, if there's no change, there's no change. Very old therapy, bit of therapeutic wisdom. If there's no change, there's no change. So people really do have to think about how they get away from what caused the depression in the first place, if they're going to have long-lasting change in their lives. So what about challenging experiences? I don't believe in so-called bad trips. A challenging experience is always something that's come up for you that you need to actually look at. Very often, a person can have a challenging experience if they haven't actually faced the problem, if they've turned around and they've run away, if they haven't been prepared properly in terms of the possibility that, they might see a monster, and been given some hints on how to cope with this monster. So before the session, in the preparation, you preempt that the monsters might appear, and you give them the tools to cope with the monster. You reassure them that you're there, you can hold their hand, nothing bad is going to happen, and to engage with this monster and ask it what it has to say to you. So a lot of that can mitigate how challenging the person finds the experience. Afterwards, it's about working through, what is this monster? After all, it's something that's come out from inside themselves. And if you follow the principle that this has come to teach you something, then, you could spend quite a lot of very fruitful therapy hours thinking about what that is and working through that and trying to face some of the things that it may represent for you. So after the experience, the therapy models going forward, you've got ACT, you've got internal family systems, you've got Jungian therapy, and you've got the ACE model, which I should have included there, I didn't. And then the question mark basically indicates that pretty much any other therapy can be made to fit in with this work. So in training therapists, we're not saying to them, look, you have to give up your favorite theory completely. But you have to try and think about how it can support what's happened and not negate the experience the person's had. So it's an and model. So the ones I've mentioned here are just the ones that are being written about now, most commonly. But no doubt you can make any kind of therapy fit in with this if you're flexible enough as a therapist. So finally, how do people get to do this work and what are the training issues? Well, I would say, first of all, I think you really need to think long and hard about if you want to do this work, whether you've done enough work on yourself, whether it's really you're prepared for the demands and the challenges that can come from doing this work, whether you can face the less glamorous aspects of it. As it stands now, it's not terribly highly paid work. We don't know what the future is going to hold with this. The myth out there is that it's expensive, but I think in terms of the long-term effects, and if you cost up all the follow-up therapy, it actually isn't. But so I think there's a certain amount of givens that need to be in place first. I think if you are very new to this, very fresh, and you don't have any experience, the answer is go and get some experience. Go and do some supervised work in therapy. Get some therapy for yourself. And possibly don't rush into it. Training and training issues. I think good training courses will incorporate a very careful selection process. They won't just allow anyone into the training, because two things can happen. One is you get people coming into the work that come in for the wrong motivation, that are poorly prepared, and might get burnt or feel that they don't achieve much. The other issue is that you're sending people out into the world to work with people who really aren't up to doing the work. And, there's probably a whole another lecture around the possible dangers and risks that can happen with that. So there are some reputable training courses. There isn't a controlling body that provides accreditation. So any course that's claiming to be accredited is not right. It's not so. Currently, the best in the world are probably the MAPS training for MDMA or the CIIS training in California. Some other very good training courses coming up overseas. And most of them will incorporate a range of skills around knowledge, background, history, that kind of thing. But the strongest focus needs to be on the skills of the therapist to actually work therapeutically with a person. A whole lot of intellectual knowledge is not going to send people out there with enough skills to do the work and to do justice for the people that come along with these difficulties. You almost need to know very well how to work with the difficulties in your other models, so you need to be experienced. That's where I'm going to stop. So I will leave it open to questions now.
That was great. Thanks, Renee. The first question I've got for you: I work in harm reduction and often deal with psychedelic crises at events. What are some techniques that harm reduction workers could utilize?
I think when you're in a harm reduction situation, the most important thing is, I think there are two things. The one is you need to know what your safety protocol is. So you need to know how to look out for risks. If you do harm reduction training, they will take you through this, so that you need to know when the person's in a real medical crisis and what to do and how to get them to a position of safety. Other than that, it's about this, just being with them, just being calm, remaining calm yourself, and being supportive, just being a supportive presence. Very reassuring, talk them through it, don't leave them alone. That's the best way, I think, to do it. But of course, I think the upfront, I think it's tricky for people to be doing having any of these experiences outside of a well-structured and well-held space. I know of a couple of instances of people who had taken, had these experiences recreationally, even though one person that I knew in the UK was slipped a drug at a party and never ever recovered from it. Very, very sad. He had a complete breakdown because he didn't know what was happening to him. So I think the best harm reduction, if you're going to do this, first of all, don't do it. But if you are, just be very, very careful that you know you're going to be safely and carefully held.
Sure, and hopefully don't take something unexpectedly at a party. I think that's not an ideal circumstance. Someone was wondering if you could talk to us about differences that you'd seen in psychedelic research and clinical services in Australia compared to your work in the UK.
Well, I haven't seen much in Australia yet. I haven't been here all that long, and it's been locked down almost since the day I arrived. But I'm hoping to get involved in some of the research very soon. I'm really looking forward to this. So I've done the training, I've done the MAPS training and the training for psilocybin therapy at Monash. So, anywhere else I can get involved in some of this therapy would be absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, great. And I know it's, not many people have that training, so it's fantastic that we have you here because, undoubtedly this is going to be a big thing, and the more people ready to deal with that, the better. Regarding therapists, the value of the female-male dyad is widely recognised. But are there other balances, such as personal qualities or professional skills, between the therapists that are also important?
I think this is where you need to be a little flexible again in terms of what the person needs. One of the examples, one of the sessions I had in Imperial that brought me in because this person had a very significant relationship with a grandmother and had issues around that. So they wanted me there as a kind of older woman presence. And I've done sessions with another female partner as well. So I think you can be flexible in terms of that, So I always say I can always try and channel my inner bloke and, bring a bit of masculine energy or something. I don't know. But yes, if you can't ideally get the male-female dyad, then, you can be flexible.
And how about techniques that you might recommend for aftercare or support for people who experience mystical or profound experiences that they find to be psychologically destabilising?
I think the first thing is to just let them talk about it. Let them talk about it as openly and as unconfrontationally as possible. The last thing you need to do is try and impose an explanation or a structure, or try and impose your own beliefs on them at all. Let's go along with what they tell you. Just let them talk it through. I found I'm had quite a long years as a therapist, and the value of just listening to the person and listening to them unconditionally is so healing. In many cases, people find their own answers. They really find something within themselves. But if people do come out with particular religious notions that are important, I think you should redirect them to somebody within that spiritual tradition to help them more if you don't feel comfortable doing it.
I don't have any more questions here, but I did have one that I wanted to ask. And I heard you speak about Joseph Campbell, and I'm a big fan, and I totally get psychedelic vibes, but I haven't seen many people joining the dots. So I'd like to hear how you connect your understanding of psychedelics and Joseph Campbell, because I heard you mention his name.
Gosh, well, I mean, I suppose my interest in that's come very much from sort of the Jungian side of it. And I think symbolically, people can come up with a lot of symbolic stuff. I mean, the psychedelic journey can be but like a hero's journey within itself. So, I think it's about encouraging people to go on that journey and find the treasure and come back. But as a Jungian, my approach mostly in therapy is about meaning making. It's about thinking about your narrative, about the story of your life, how that all fits together. I hope that's answered your question. I can't really say very much more about that.
No, I think when you trail off like that, you've nailed Joseph Campbell, right? It's about a feeling, not about what's actually being said. Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we have.
All right. Thank you very much.